Welcome to Citizens Forum. I'm your host, Walt McGinnis. And for the first segment here, we have with us today Bo Filter. Bo is a author, a researcher, a social scientist, would you say? Mm-hmm. And Bo has come in today to talk about, in general, about issues around warfare, and particularly about the events that are transpiring now in Syria and other areas that are very, very troubling. So I'd like to welcome you here today, Bo. And I think right off the top, we've been always looking at the Middle East, so-called Middle East, and all the bad things that are happening there. And is there a chance, do you think, that the things that are happening right now in the Eastern Mediterranean could escalate even into a greater type of war?
Well, currently, that's exactly what could happen, and we've never been so close to the tipping point of a nuclear war, because the U.S. now has their NATO armies armed with nuclear weapons and everything else on the Russian borders. And you can imagine how frightening that would be to us, or to the Americans, if Russians had nuclear weapons all along the Canadian border and the Mexican border. Yeah. It would be absolute chaos in America. You can't let this happen. So the Russians are scared to death that they're about to be squeezed into a nuclear war. Yeah. And the trigger point now really points to Syria. Hillary Clinton has said that she will push for a no-fly zone in Syria. And if she does that, if the U.S. tries to shoot all of Russia's planes out of the air, the Russians are not going to stand by for that, because the government of Syria has legally invited Russia into their airspace to help protect them from the global terrorists, and many of which are backed and sponsored by the U.S. in the first place.
And so, to add into that, just that case is that Israel, the state of Israel, has nuclear weapons also.
That's right. Israel has nuclear weapons, so I don't know how much that would play into it. Of course, they could use them as well. The whole thing now has been about trying to make tactical nuclear weapons appear conventional so that you can use them at will. Yeah. And now the U.S. is guilty of using tactical nuclear weapons in, I think the last time I counted was 12 countries. Now these tactical weapons use depleted uranium in the point of their shells, and when they hit like a tank, they just rip it apart like a little aluminum tin can hit with a big firecracker or something. But it pollutes the land with depleted uranium forever. Yeah. So now we see all these children being born across Afghanistan, Yugoslavia, all the countries that have been hit with these weapons, where the deformed children are being born with things like 2 heads. It's an incredible thing, but the news won't report it because they don't want us to know how bad these weapons really are.
Now, what do you think the ultimate goal is? I mean, this is very high stakes. Obviously, nobody wins in a nuclear war. Why would the Americans be playing this sort of a game?
Well, there's a couple things. There's stages. There's an old thing in the Pentagon called escalation dominance. You know, full spectrum dominance means to control the world completely, but escalation means you up the ante one step at a time. So the first stage of this then would be the fact that if you can terrorize Russia into surrendering, we're going to nuke you, and we look at us, we are crazy, we're about to,
I was going to say, just convince the Russians that you're crazy enough to do it.
They might surrender at the last minute, because there are Western shills inside of Russia working full time, trying to pull Putin down and undermine their government and bring in a Western proxy government to Russia. So there's all kinds of parties playing into this. So the first line then is to try to get Russia to back down out of fear, out of terror. Yeah. But the ultimate goal then is they want them to back down because Russia is loaded with resources. The U.S. wants those resources, or the corporations and the military industrial complex that wants access to all this. And they had a heyday during the 90s, so under Boris Yeltsin, president of Russia. because, as we know, in December of '91, that's when the Soviet Union collapsed. And boy, Americans thought, oh, wow, we can have a peace dividend then. But then the opportunists thought, no, now we can have permanent war.
Yeah.
Cheney and Halliburton and wars forever, because now we can take over the entire planet. So they made their move very briskly under the Wolfowitz doctrine. So the ultimate goal using that is full spectrum dominance of the entire planet. And we get books like, well, we could take, for example, this book here. I don't know if they can show it. It's the title of Zygmunt Brzezinski's book, The Grand.
You can just hold that up.
It's called The Grand Chessboard. And the subtitle is American Primacy and its Geostrategic Imperatives. Now, this is psychobabble to the average person.
Yeah.
But people who read well and understand what they're talking about, this is cryptic but very specific. American primacy is not primacy of the American people, the exceptional people over the world. They're talking about the Americans as the elite Americans that rule over American and their primacy over the world. They don't care how many people in California live in their cars.
Right. But they're exercising that primacy with military and economic might.
Right, and the primacy is that they their idea of the unipolar world.
Yeah.
I mean, if there's no poles in the world, well, then there's only a dictatorship.
Yeah.
And what a fancy way to call it dictatorship, a unipolar world. But you see, that world is based on what we can call the unipolar perspective. That is the propaganda term for bringing this all about, a uniperspective.
Yeah.
Well, what could that be? Well, we could actually coin it, bring it down to 4 words, and what would that be? And evil East,
Yeah.
angelic West.
There you go. So you
So
can't
that's
really
an umbrella.
you can't step outside of that paradigm.
If a journalist or anyone, news anchor falls outside that umbrella, they either lose their job or they'll be reprimanded and be on their way out, so to speak. So the narrative always falls within that. You can say a lot of things and it looks like the media is rich in news and different sides of the perspective, but guess what? It all falls under this umbrella,
Yeah.
evil East, angelic West.
Yeah.
So now today, pinpointing the evil Muslims, it just so happens when we talk about the geostrategic imperatives, the imperative is to control all the resources of the world. And the Muslims just so happen to live on 70% of the land where the last known oil and gas reserves are.
Yeah.
So the process has always been to demonize whoever has the resources. So now, instead of the communists, because they kind of fell apart with the Soviet Union, they had to have a new enemy, and so we replaced the communists with terrorists.
Exactly, and you see the dismantling of countries in the Mediterranean region, Western powers, NATO and all that, going in and bombing, for instance, Libya, and basically bombed them back to the 18th century.
Yes.
And the thing is that what I think I'd like to touch on here is the role of NATO. What NATO's relationship is with Turkey, for instance, and how ISIS fits into this picture, because we can't go over a whole heck of a lot. There's so much, but I think because we just had a little discussion just before the show, and we were talking about how there's you're saying we're good, they're bad. That's the only dialogue we can have. Well, what happens when you have a country like Turkey? And by the way, remember Turkey stationed the first nuclear warheads pointed at the Soviet Union during the Cuban Missile Crisis, or prior to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so, Turkey's been playing a role, a very certain type of role for the West for a lot of years.
Yes, they've been
So now we have NATO stationed in Turkey.
Yes.
And then we have all these ISIS fighters appearing in neighboring states. So what do you think's happening there?
Well, these fighters are all coming through Turkey. They're coming from, you'll see countries around the world, countries that are starving. People have no jobs, and if they get a paycheck, a monthly paycheck to go kill people, they'll take it. They're absolutely desperate. but the recruiting of poor people in jihad fashion,
Yeah.
people that have religious bents or something, that's the best candidates for getting them to be recruits in these. And the last time I looked, there were 188 mercenary armies that the U.S. could bring its troops out of that cesspool of people to fight their jihad in the Middle East.
Yeah.
So Al-Qaeda, all these Free Syrian Army, ISIS, all these are all derivatives of the Afghanistan Taliban
Yeah.
of trying to suck Russia into invading Afghanistan in 1979 under Brzezinski's book, The Grand Chessboard.
Yeah.
He wanted to drain Russia's economy, force them into a war that they couldn't get out of, and a democratically elected government in Afghanistan was invaded by the CIA, etc., which basically forced the Russians to come in to protect them.
Yeah.
But then, of course, the media, the Western media, Evil East, Angelica, see, those evil people, there they are. They went in there, they're trying to expand across the world, but yet it's the U.S. that has troops in almost every country.
Yeah.
And if we don't have troops, we have economic hitmen like John Perkins, who wrote his book, Confessions of an Economic
That's
Hitman.
right.
Okay, so John Perkins is saying, well, we go in and we give them ultimatums. And we say, you turn your economy over to the boys in Washington, or, well, we might send in some nasties.
Yeah.
You know, we might kill the president, and if that doesn't work, we'll send in the troops ultimately.
Yeah, and if you look at Latin America and all the countries in Latin America that went through that process.
They've all gone through that. They call it neoliberalism.
You know.
They're going to liberate them from their resources, really.
Yeah. So, you know, back to Turkey, Syria,
Okay.
back to the Russians, because when I was reading what Putin did when he went in a few months ago and had a bombing campaign, by all reports, it was very successful campaign. He was helping the Syrian government, who invited him in, which is there's some legitimacy there.
Yes.
And however, it doesn't seem to be working out for the Americans.
Well, no, it isn't, because their goal, full spectrum dominance, is to have regime change in Syria. Ultimately, they want Syria for pipelines for them to profit from the Eastern Central Asian oil to come through Syria to Europe that U.S. oil companies are going to profit for. But that's not in the news.
Yeah.
It's all about those crazy people in the East that we can't stop them from killing each other.
Even the economic model, though, Syria was a communist country.
Syria, a communist country?
Wasn't it a communist country or a president socialist, let's say? But they were operating perhaps slightly outside of the World Bank, IMF, financial establishment.
That's right. They're not bending to the Western establishment. So that automatically makes you a target of the West, because the international bankers and the CIA, who does a lot of the dirty work for them, they're all involved in it. The thing, though, as you asked me first about not going so well for the U.S. in Syria, is the fact that the Russians were invited in. Now they have stationed their advanced weapon systems, the S-300s, the S-400s, the S-500s, and now the Satan II program is available and ready to go. You don't want to embroil Russia in a total knockout war, because their weaponry is extremely advanced. And the U.S. corporations that have just built the U.S. economy for decades and made a fortune on the military-industrial complex, their weapons just aren't as advanced. And so they're really playing with fire. And so we really have to get the people to start to rally around, go to your government and say, no nuclear war. We've got to stop this.
Nuclear war is not an option. Hillary Clinton's bragging that she's willing to use the first strike option, and I think the public have to realize just how dangerous that notion is. But we're going to have to leave it there, Bo. Okay. We're going to have you back. Okay. We have 5 different avenues to explore just from our brief conversation. It's a great pleasure to have you here today. Thank you very much. So that completes this segment of Citizens Forum. Welcome back to the Citizens Forum. Today I have with me Brian Birchall, and Brian's been on the program several times. Brian's with the Association for Responsible and Environmentally Sustainable Sewage Treatment, otherwise known as ARREST. And you'll see a URL pop up there at some point if you want to go to the website. Now, Brian has been studying the issues around this proposed sewage treatment plant for many years. Brian's looking very, very carefully at the science and the biological implications of putting in a new treatment plant. And Brian's been contacting the government and asking them very pointed questions about how they've come to make these decisions. Welcome to the show, Brian.
Thank you very much.
Now, you have been corresponding with the Federal Environment Minister McKenna regarding the lack of scientific evidence showing that a new treatment system would be an improvement over what we already have, and as well regarding the government's designation that Victoria's situation here with sewage treatment is a high-risk situation. Right. Now, can you give us some updates on that?
Yeah. First of all, it's not my science. I'm corresponding with the various marine scientists, public health officers, and engineers. So I'm bringing forth the evidence that's already there, and I'm trying to inform more politicians and the government, and citizens. Yes, I have a response from the Minister of the Environment, Catherine McKenna, and once again, it's they made a slight change. I pointed out that they said that it's untreated. Well, we don't have untreated. Our system treats. So they come back with untreated and undertreated. So they've now changed their wording. And then they've gone on and said that they are informed by the science that if we proceed with this project, that there will be significant long-term environmental and economic benefits. So once again, I would be writing back and saying, please provide us with the science that you're relying on, because the scientists here, in fact, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans' own scientists as well are contradicting the minister. The Minister McKenna's parliamentary secretary is Mr. Jonathan Wilkinson, and it's the phrasing here is very much like him. So it seems that he's writing these for her, and he is also recently, in September, when he was last year in September. He stated, we revisited the science and the federal government is comfortable that this is an appropriate step from an environmental perspective. So the project is an appropriate step, he's saying. So once again, what's the science? So I did a Freedom of Information request. I sent to the Ministry of the Environment and asked for the science. Please provide us with the science. And they have 30 days to respond. Well, in more than 30 days, I finally received a response, and they said, we're going to take another 60 days, thank you very much. They want 90 days to give me an answer to provide us with the science. So that certainly looks like a stalling tactic, because if, in fact, they just reviewed the science to agree with what the CRD is doing, then that should be on somebody's desk still, or very nearby, or in somebody's recent memory, and they should be able to dig that up in no time.
Yeah, but
instead,
the science is like real hard data, like research on the impacts on the ocean, done in a methodological way, expert opinion in public health, for instance, marine biologists, the best we can get for getting the information. So generally, this stuff should be available to the public, shouldn't it?
It certainly is. It is very available. That's correct. Yeah. So why is the Minister of the Environment, with a staff, not able to give us that right away? I mean, this is a $1 billion project, and so that kind of information the minister should have, or the minister's office should have, ready to support their statement that, oh yeah, we've reviewed the science. And
so there is evidence but to the contrary, isn't there, that this is not a good way to go?
Well, the regulations, well, let's put it not so. It's a poor use of funds.
Yeah.
Yes, there may be some improvement to the marine environment, as one of the marine scientists at UVic said. Yeah, there would be an improvement to the marine environment. It would be so small, and there'd be so much harm to the air and the land as you move the treatment onto the land. That's going to have impacts. The net would be likely a setback. So if it's setback or break even or slightly better, the point that they make is it's just not worth $1 billion. This is a very, yes, there are things that we could spend money on, they could recommend to spend money on, to improve the marine environment, this is not something that they would recommend. I want to also point out in this business of we're going to spend to supposedly fix a problem. How bad a problem is it? Here's another indicator. Victoria keeps getting awards for being one of the most beautiful cities to live in. We wouldn't be getting those if we had a sewage problem.
Yeah.
And here, just 10 days ago, an organization called, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Condé Nast, ranked us 7th in the world.
Yeah.
7th best city in the world. And what was particularly interesting is their description of Victoria includes, and how to enjoy Victoria, is take a half-mile walk over the sea at Ogden Point Breakwater, which is right between the two outfalls. So they're saying go to where the treatment system currently is,
Yeah.
and it's not a problem. They're not even aware that that's where the sewage treatment is.
Yeah. Now, CRD citizens have been expressing concern about the risk of failures of parts of a new sewage treatment system, such as the pipes, and I think also the pumps and all that, because now we're getting into a pumping situation. Are their concerns realistic?
Yes. As you go to more mechanization, that's what this is about. It's a greater amount of mechanization to treat. Currently, we're using natural treatment that's doing a great job, plus a small amount of what we call preliminary treatment, so on land, and the major portion of the treatment is being done by the harsh conditions of the ocean. So as you go to more mechanization, a big plant and all the machinery and the pumps and so on, it gets more complex and there's a higher risk of failure. And we saw an example of that right here in Canada, in Halifax. Halifax did have a problem. They did have a sewage problem. They were dropping theirs into a harbor. That's not what we're doing. We're putting ours out into the straits, which is entirely different. Into the harbor in Halifax was causing a problem, and so they did need to improve that. And they spent the money, and it was opened in July of 2008. In January 2009, the system broke down, and it took $11 million to fix it, and it was closed down for 18 months. That's a pretty serious failure. Plus, in the construction of it, it turned out, unbeknownst to them, they had damaged an existing pipe system, and they didn't know it. And after everything was built and all the fill was put back in and they get it up and running, then they discover they got a leak.
Wow.
And so that cost another $860,000, almost $1 million, to fix that. So the thing is, yeah, problems do happen. I know the engineers do the best they can in the design and contractors in constructing it right and so on. But good as we try, there's certainly a risk for failures. And so people are quite reasonable in being concerned about.
Just so we cover this off, if you were to think about what are as taxpayers and ratepayers of this region, what are the major things that we should be concerned about with this project overall?
Have we been given the truth? That'd be one thing. Has the CRD been completely open with the public? And that pops to mind because just this month, in this month's Focus magazine, I'll say the name, the Focus magazine, the editor there has done again, another excellent article, very well researched, and pointing out that the system that's been approved, it was recommended by the project board, and it's been approved by the CRD. That system, it turns out, is designed, the design of it is that we'll hit capacity about the time the plant opens. So we're not going to have a plant that's going to handle the capacity for 20 years, as the vice chair of the project board said.
Yeah.
The engineering firm's own warnings to the CRD is that this is likely to start hitting capacity 2 years before it opens. So somewhere between 2018 to 2023, 5 years, but we'll probably start bumping up against capacity. So the plant is that's part of the reason that it's now cheaper.
Yeah.
They downsize it and to fit it into the McLaughlin. But the cost is that we're going to start bumping up against it's not going to have the capacity. But they said, well, there's a solution to that, and it's called chemically enhanced primary treatment. They can start pouring chemicals into the wastewater, which helps speed up the removal of the solids that they want to send to Heartland. So that's their solution. We'll build it smaller, and when we start going over capacity, we'll start throwing chemicals in. Is that okay? Well, it turns out the chemicals that are used then make the sludge unusable. You can't or let's put it another way, operators of incinerators don't want to then incinerate it.
Yeah.
And it's not, it becomes unusable. And that's a problem that they're having in Ontario right now. Ontario doesn't have the choice of using the ocean for a treatment system as we do. So they're having to handle the sludge, and they're using chemical enhancement, and it's making the sludge unusable.
So it's toxic sludge.
I'm not sure I could say toxic, but it becomes a problem. It can't, you can't start spreading on the land as some people think you could, but these chemicals start to cause that to not be usable that way. So the project board has apparently recognized this. They seem to have known it, because the plan is to just put the sludge into great big storage tanks at Heartland, and they've said that maybe someday somebody will figure out how to make use of it, and then it's there to be mined.
Hard to take any comfort in that plan.
I agree with you. They don't have a solution to how to handle it. They're going to start removing it from the ocean where it's doing some good. It's feeding the food chain, and they're going to start storing it, not knowing what the heck we're ever going to do with it.
Particularly, it's close to where I live, and I can see the Heartland landfill as I drive by there every day. And they're going to be putting this stuff, whatever you want to call it, at the top of the water table, at the top of the watershed.
Yeah.
So if there's a problem, it's got a long ways to run
It'll
to get to
trickle
the
down.
ocean.
Yeah.
So if we're running into any problems, it could be a lot of damage.
There's
caused.
a bit more to this story that the article points out by Focus Magazine, and that is that by undersizing this, okay, go back a bit.
Yeah.
The CRD did not want to have a distributed system. They wanted to have one plant to handle the region's sewage.
Yeah.
So they did not want a distributed system. What we got, it turns out now, is going to be a distributed system, because this one's now undersized.
Yeah.
And the approved plan says, well, let's spend $2 million to research a second plant out in the western communities. So they're already looking at a second plant.
Yeah.
And the article actually makes the point that we're probably looking at 3 plants eventually.
Yeah.
And so we're ending up with a distributed system, which is not going to be the $750 million for the McLaughlin. Even if McLaughlin comes in on budget at $750 billion, they're already looking at other plants, certainly another one, and maybe a third. So the thing is, this project is going to end up costing way more than $1 billion.
Yeah.
And his point is, it doesn't seem that the public is being told this.
Yeah.
It seems. And he goes further, actually, and he thinks that it's so serious is what's not being told to the public, and the public is not therefore aware of how costly this would be, how much borrowing, and what's being taken away from the public is the right to vote on whether or not to approve the funding that's going to be required. And so he has actually made the point that there may be room for a legal challenge here.
This would be in our favor. Something, if it's so blatant, if it's such a high level of well, I don't want to know what to call it, but it's a huge mistake at the best, that possibly legal recourse might save us. You know.
It's gone so far as to say that some people are sitting on information that the public should know.
You know.
And so he's spoken to a lawyer in town, and he's actually closed his article off with an invitation to the public to notify Focus Magazine it's at Focus Publish at shaw.ca. And he's inviting people to email focuspublish@shaw.ca or phone him at Focus Magazine. And he'd like to know what interest there is in a legal challenge.
You know, that's the article in the November, or this November.
Should be just out
Focus
today, I believe.
Magazine, yeah. So it'll be out for a couple of weeks by the time anybody sees our show.
Online, should be online, or hard copies of it. He's done an excellent job, and people should be reading that and seriously consider. This is not a new idea. This happened in the United States as well. It happened in the United States where there was overzealous regulators pushing to have treatment systems, and it took court cases.
Yeah.
People had to get it into court to take the politics out of it, and we may need to do the same.
Well, that's great. Okay, Brian, every time you come here, we understand a little bit more of the situation.
I hope the public does.
You're not free of us yet. You're going to have to come back a few more times, I'm sure, as the saga unfolds. I can tell you I appreciate this so much, because I've learned so much myself just preparing for the interviews. So thank you very much, and look forward to seeing you in the future.
Thanks for having me on.
Stay tuned, folks, for the next segment of Citizens Forum. Welcome back to Citizens Forum. I have with me today David Murner, who's the Vice President of Fair Vote Canada and has pretty well everybody knows by now that Fair Vote Canada is advocating for a more democratic and fair way to elect our governments, particularly looking at the issues around proportional representation. Welcome to the show today,
Thanks very
David.
much.
It appears that of all the voting systems being considered for our federal elections, proportional representation is the most democratic and the favorite amongst Canadians. Can you outline the advantages of proportional representation over our current first-past-the-post system?
Yes, I'd be happy to do that. A key issue for us is that if 30% of the people vote for one party, then 30% of the seats in the legislature should be for that party. And that's not how it works right now. We have an unfair system that essentially says you could have 39% of the vote and get 100% of the power in Ottawa, 54% of the seats. This actually happened in the last 2 federal elections. So there's a lot of disproportionality in our system. The other thing is that voters' votes don't all count in this system. About 9 million people in the last election voted for a party that didn't, or voted for a person whose party didn't get in to the legislature. We call those wasted votes, and we can do better. Proportional representation is a way of making sure that more of those votes count. And that's one of the things the federal Liberals campaigned on last time, which was make every vote count, and we're saying proportional representation is the solution for that.
Now, on the ground, like, we were talking about the issue around, say, the Site C Dam, and very controversial issue. There's overlapping jurisdictions, provincial and federal jurisdictions. But nevertheless, the approvals for this dam seem to have gone through very quickly and very rapidly, over the heads of most of the public, as well as the First Nations people and everything like that. Now, under a proportional representation system, would that, those, let's say, those sort of majority governments that have sort of dictatorial control, how would they be reined in and maybe not being able to push through a dam like that as quickly?
That's a very good question. It would depend on the coalition. And if a lot of Canadians or British Columbians were voting for a progressive Green coalition, then that coalition would be represented proportionate to the number of people who voted for it in the legislature.
Yeah.
And the evidence from the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, and many of the Nordic countries are countries that have proportional representation systems, and they tend to be more progressive, and green issues seem to be highlighted more in those countries, according to the academics who have testified in our parliamentary committee, the House of Commons committee that's studying these things.
Right.
So it would make it more difficult for some of these projects to go through. There would be more scrutiny anyway.
Yeah, I'm sure you've been reading the papers like we all have, and looking at the media, and looking at the statements that have been made in the media about how it's going with the multi-party committee and some of the things that have been going on. Mm-hmm. Now, Canadians voted for Trudeau at least partly because of his promise to reform the electoral system. And as well, according to the polling, it seems that proportional representation is still the most preferred voting system for Canadians of all political stripes. The Liberal Party platform in the last election was direct and to the point. We are committed to ensuring 2015 will be the last federal election conducted under first-past-the-post voting system. And as well, they said, within 18 months of forming government, we will introduce legislation to enact electoral reform. Now, do you think that given the Liberals' clear statement to introduce electoral reform during the campaign and all that, and the support from the public, with the ongoing support from the public, is this not a clear mandate already for the government to make changes to a more democratic system without taking any other steps?
I think it's crystal clear. I think that the federal Liberals made a very clear commitment in the last campaign. I ran for the federal Liberals in the last campaign, and I was there when Trudeau announced the electoral reform policy in Ottawa, and all the candidates were ranged behind him, and we were very, very committed to this idea. And so I think the key is, are we going to deliver? Is the Liberal government going to deliver on this or not?
Yeah.
And people are saying maybe they'll back off. They got a large majority. Like Harper, the Liberals had 39% of the vote, 100% of the power. Why change now, right?
Yeah.
But I think the commitment was so clear that there would be a very significant cost if they backed away. The other thing is the NDP and the Greens ran on proportional representation as well, right? So there is a coalition there. 63% of voters voted for a party advocating electoral reform. So I think the answer to your question is there's a clear commitment, and it's time to deliver now.
And it's at their peril if they step back away now. Of course, we talked about this all-party committee that exploring the alternatives, but Miriam Monsef, is it?
Right, that's right.
She's the Minister of Democratic Institutions. Now, she was here in Victoria not too long ago, right? And she reiterated that the government will not move forward on any reforms without broad support of Canadians. And also in the Le Devoir interview, Trudeau said less dramatic changes to the voting system, like the ranked ballot system, would require less support. Now, are these recent statements by Mr. Trudeau and Miriam Monsef cause for concern that the government may be backtracking on its election promises?
You know, I think it's a little bit too early to tell. I think a lot of people are concerned that they are backing away. But I think what's going to happen is there will be a public outcry. People will be writing their MPs, writing the Prime Minister, and saying, you made a promise. And it was a very clear promise last year in the federal election, and we want you to deliver on it. And I had a chance to talk to Minister Monsef when she was here in Victoria, and we chatted about it. And I think, you know, their heart is in the right place. She'd probably want to deliver on electoral reform. That's her job. But a key issue is going to be, how does this work out in the Liberal caucus? Atlantic Canadian MPs are all Liberal because of our current system, and a change to proportional representation would mean fewer Liberal MPs from Atlantic Canada, and that's a difficult political situation to be in. But what I'm hoping is that the government will stay true to its word, and 2015 will be the last first past the post election, and they'll make every vote count. But it's,
the other
tough.
strategy is, in my view, was if Mr. Trudeau and the cabinet decide to go this route and to advocate for proportional representation and bring it about, that they would always be in the lead of any coalition government forever.
That's exactly what I think.
That's my argument.
Right. The Liberals are in the middle ground, and the Liberals have historically been very good at borrowing ideas from the NDP, borrowing ideas from the Conservatives. They're coming in with a carbon tax now. The Greens will like that. I agree with that.
Even if you weren't sincere, the Machiavellian part of it, for me, I'm adding it up going, gee.
You're permanently forming governments.
Because you're always the biggest player in the coalition.
That's my assessment as well.
I just want to bring up this last point because Kelly Carmichael is the executive director of Fair Vote Canada, and I'm sure you know her well, told the All-Party Committee that proportional representation is the only legitimate choice. Of the 99 experts who testified during the committee's hearings, she said more than 90 favored some form of proportional representation. Only 5 favored a ranked ballot, for instance, which would not result in a distribution of seats proportional to the votes cast. So I'm going to ask you is, do you think Trudeau may be confused thinking that a ranked ballot system to be a proportional representation voting system?
No, I think he's very clear that a majority of Canadians want proportional representation. I think we're at a historic turning point. This would be the biggest change in our electoral system in a century. So it's a very big decision. And there will be some opposition to it, including opposition from his own caucus. So it's a very tough political decision. But his dad brought in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We have had these big changes happen before, but it takes leadership. And the test in the coming 6 to 8 months is, does Justin Trudeau have the leadership it takes to get this through? That's the big question.
It's really, of all the issues that you think back in your lifetime, and free trade, for instance, and some of these new or trade deals, which are, so controversial and so detrimental, in my view, to the best interest of the Canadian public. This is right up there with that level of decision making, that this could completely change how the voting happens in Canada, but like Rick Hapgood has pointed out, it changes the culture.
It'll change the culture.
How we act.
Politicians will have to cooperate. We won't see the craziness that we see in the States right now with their presidential campaign. We'll see a lot more focus on working together, forming coalitions, and finding consensus. And that's the Canadian way.
Yeah. It's so remarkable because I just was watching PBS and there was a show about Sweden, And they were talking about it was a housing crisis of sort in Stockholm where they were having a hard time people finding apartments, and then they were talking about how they resolved that. And somebody was interviewing a person there just off the street, and they said, "Well, how do you make this all work?" And she said, "Well, basically, we get together and talk about it, and we talk about it until we finally come to a consensus, and it doesn't matter how long it takes." And if you look at how successful their government is, and I think that's the other measuring stick, is if you look for poverty, if you look at the other big issues of social issues around drug addiction and homelessness, you don't see that there.
What
So
would you
it
rather?
must be working.
I completely agree. What kind of country would you have? A Nordic country, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and so on? Or would you rather have the political culture you see in the United States, which is a badly broken political culture? And same in the UK. They have real deep problems there. And it's not surprising that the UK, the US, Canada, we have these ancient democracies which haven't progressed, and it's time for change. That's what the Liberals campaigned on, real change. And the question is, will they deliver?
Now, who would you recommend? What would you recommend the viewers to do if they wanted to get engaged in this conversation?
I would say write to the Prime Minister, preferably a handwritten letter. And it's free postage. Put it in the mailbox. Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada. Also Maryam Monsef, another wonderful person, a very inspiring personal story. Write to Minister Monsef, Minister for Democratic Institutions, and say it's time for change. You campaigned on real change, and we want you to make it happen. Live up to your promises.
Now, if you were to contact Fair Vote Canada, are there people monitoring the site and giving
We're
answers?
on there all the time, www.fairvote.ca. And you'll see, we update it regularly. We're tracking the House of Commons Committee, which, by the way, is reporting on December 1st, so that's something to look forward to.
Yeah, that's coming out.
Their report will come out on December 1st. And hopefully they found a compromise, too, because again, you might remember the Liberal government did something unusual. They said, we're going to have proportional representation on this committee. We're not going to exercise our majority. So that was a good sign. And so if they keep going down in that track, you know, the sunny ways, cooperate track, I have some hope that they'll actually deliver on this. But for viewers out there, I suggest write the minister, write the Prime Minister and say, it's time for real change.
Yeah, I think that's the bottom line right now, is that they are kind of floating these balloons a little bit, as politicians do, to see what stays up in the air and to see how much they have to do. And now's the time to really push for this. So David Marner, it's been always a pleasure to have you here, and I'm sure we're going to have you back because this is just an evolving story.
Thanks very much.
And hopefully, you know, in the next upcoming months, we're going to see some real change happening.
I hope so too.
It's been my pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
So that concludes this segment of Citizens Forum. Welcome back to Citizens Forum, and I'd like to take the opportunity to thank all the great volunteers for this show, and to the Shaw management and staff that help us pull this off every week. And without any of you folks, we wouldn't have a show at all. So thank you very much for that. For our final interview today, we have with us Tyson Strandland. Tyson is with the Young Communist League, and will be the candidate for the Esquimalt-Metchosin riding in the next upcoming provincial election in the spring. Tyson is just coming back today from a rally that happened at the University of Victoria, in which they were asking for free post-secondary education, and that's today is a day of demonstrations across the country. So welcome to the show, Tyson.
Thank you.
Maybe you firstly just give us an update of what happened today and what were the main components of your rally.
Right. Well, it was actually a pan-Canadian day of action today. So across the country, there were at least more than 50 universities who were all participating in this. It was initiated by the Canadian Federation of Students. And basically we were calling for free post-secondary education. That's not just university, but education in trades and the whole works for all everyone in Canada. And we had a coalition of different sort of organizations from the university helping out, working together. We really wanted it to be a non-partisan issue, but the Young NDP helped, the UVA Greens, Socialist Fight Back, and so I'm very appreciative of our opportunity to work with all these guys.
Yeah, and I suppose other other political parties, for instance, the Conservative Party, what was their reaction to your rally?
Well, the UVic Conservatives and the UVic Liberals were certainly both invited.
Yeah.
They were excluded by their own decision.
Yeah. So, the Rob Fleming came to the rally and
Yes,
spoke?
he did. Rob Fleming came on behalf of the NDP and the education critic, and
Yeah.
he gave a speech.
And what was your impression? Was are the provincial NDP thinking of these terms in these terms or not?
Well, certainly he talked very positively about the event and spoke very supportively, but looking at the history of the NDP, I'm not sure, I'm convinced that voting an NDP majority government is going to solve our educational problems.
Yeah, perhaps we're going to need proportional representation provincially before we see big decisions like this made. Now, I've traveled around the world a little bit, and I was very interested in how their societies work, and particularly education. And often you'll see in so many countries around the world that post-secondary education is already funded and free by the government. And I have a good friend who's in Germany right now, or has been back and forth to Germany, and is planning on being educated in Germany. And there's an opportunity there to not have to be saddled with a huge debt load of trying to take loans out to sustain yourself for several years. So do you use as any country in the world as a model that shows that funding post-secondary education actually does work?
Well, when you say work, I can only imagine that you're referring in an economic sense more
Yeah.
broadly, that it has some sort of monetary benefit.
Yeah.
Either.
Well, let's start with that.
Well, I think there's a couple ways to look at that, right? I mean, there's on the one hand, education has really been commodified, right?
Yeah.
And we always see these arguments even from well-meaning activists that, either
Yeah.
it's a personal individual investment that, again, should have some sort of return, or it's a public investment that, should benefit society. And, I've got a lot of arguments that certainly
Yeah.
would indicate it is those things.
Yeah.
However, I don't think it's necessarily most useful to sell it in these terms because, that's really what's driving this commodification and a growing sort of corporate influence over our education system, right? And it's tailoring people to fit into this existing sort
Well,
of
the universal, I think the term was like universal knowledge, or the idea was just to have a well-rounded understanding of your existence, if nothing else, to just understand in general terms about a lot of things that are happening.
Right, absolutely. And like this sort of, it's a natural human drive for knowledge and progress that has always allowed this to happen, right? But now that's being largely stifled by corporations who, are pushing for austerity. Corporations are calling the shots about what faculty will get funding, what won't, right? They've got CEOs sitting on a lot of the boards and stuff, which for me is a massive conflict of interest.
Yeah.
And, it's to the point that they're even influencing the outcome of scientific and social research, right?
Well, you see sometimes people used to refer to the military-industrial complex, and now they're adding a couple more ingredients, and they call it the military-industrial academic complex. Or where they're adding in how universities are functioning now as training grounds for the corporate agenda, whatever it is, for manufacturing or control. And the universities are a key component in that shaping of the, let's say, the narrative. I mean, that's the thing we were talking about. And I lapse into it too, where I but just because I'm so overwhelmed with the terms of reference, that you constantly have to reshift your mindset and say, hang on, education. What are the fundamentals of education?
Absolutely.
And is this just a souped-up tech school that train technicians to come out that know very cleverly how to push buttons or, use test tubes or something? Or do we want something more out of our education system than what they're offering?
Right.
So I think you're going to agree that education is much more than just an opportunity. That is it a right for individuals?
I believe it is, absolutely. And our current system of financing it, it's absolutely exclusive. We've got huge underrepresentation of minorities and Indigenous people compared to
Yeah.
and it basically it's about accessibility, right? And so when we've got something that's denying certain people access, certain groups of people access, then I think we have to say it's fundamentally racist.
Yeah.
And that's unacceptable, right? But
Well, years ago I went to the university, and then I was very disenchanted with my experience there, and for a number of reasons, but one of them was that corporatization of the campus, and just this almost a military sort of mindset about a very regimented concept of why you were there, and it was an atmosphere that I found stifling, because it wasn't I wasn't there to actually broaden my worldview, but more or less to learn, like Noam Chomsky said that people go to university to learn how to be rich, because the rich are the ones that go. They learn how to act to maintain the status quo, which is there's a huge separation between those who are rich and powerful and the powerless and poor.
certainly.
So, I mean, we're still in that struggle. I don't think we're going in the right direction. You know?
And it's interesting.
Yeah.
This corporate control you're talking about here, they'll never sell it like that. It's always very benign. It's
Yeah.
strengthening ties with the private sector, right? It sounds okay.
Yeah, like who could argue with that? Hey, that's wonderful. But when you realize that corporations do research at universities all the time, and then they publish research papers, and they have a lot of legitimacy, because from the University of Victoria, from the electrical engineering department, they'll make a report on something or other, and you think, oh, well, that's great. But they don't realize that the electrical industry were the main funders in that research, and those chairs wouldn't be there at the university from the corporate funding. So you see a huge bias that's being hidden
Absolutely.
by using the shroud of the university banner to hide perhaps a very serious corporate agenda. Now, getting back to that, I think we're always looking at funding
Yes.
in society. Where are we going to spend our money, and how should we spend it? Now, for instance, in Canada, I don't know if you know this or not, but can you give me an idea of what the percentage of, or how much money is being spent on the military, for instance, compared to education?
Oh, I'm glad you asked, because this is one of the most ridiculous things I can even begin to explain to people is, when they say the money isn't there, there's estimates that it would be about $6 or $7 billion to fund education universally in Canada. Meanwhile, we spend $20 billion every year on the military, and that's not including our upcoming purchase, I should say, of the F-35 fighter jets, right? Which is going to be
Yeah.
another $126 billion approximately. So this is a drop in the ocean. Relative.
Now, are you saying $6 billion a year in Canada would fund post-secondary education?
That's the low end of the estimates. I've heard as
Yeah.
high as 10 was a recent one put out by Stats Canada, but still it's a fraction of some of these other things we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
I mean, like our top 5 banks make 35 billion?
Yeah.
35 billion in the last, in 2015?
Yeah,
Again, it's many times over, right?
massive profits.
In the same Stats Can report, they actually also indicated that over the last decade or so, we've lost about $680 billion as a result of corporate tax cuts.
Yeah,
I mean,
tax havens, offshore.
oh, that's a whole nother thing. I'm
Yeah.
talking about just the legal cutting of the corporate tax cut, right? I mean, if we add that in as well, that's a whole nother issue. And so really, the funding is there many times over. It's just a matter of how we
Yeah.
choose to allocate it, right?
Well, it seems like Canadians hold themselves up as being the sort of the peacekeepers in the world, and we always poo-poo the activities of the Americans and all their interventions and stuff like that, and we don't really understand how closely we're tied into the U.S. economies, particularly the U.S. military-industrial complex, which a lot of Canadian companies are involved in, and it affects our economy.
Oh, in a big way. The Stats Can report said that about 0.6% of GDP would pay for universal education again. However, as a member of NATO, we are obligated to spend 2% of our GDP on the military. This is just a basic requirement, and it's
Yeah.
not about effectiveness or efficiency. It's just about the sheer dollars and cents figures, right? I
Yeah.
mean, so when you think about it, it's very interesting that we're buying these F-35s. Really, we need some sort of, it's a justification, right?
Yeah.
And this ties into having our troops in the Baltics on the border with the Soviet Union, with Russia.
Yeah. These are atrocities that we're financing. These are not just little interventions or little things. No, we're talking full-on invading people and murdering them in an organized nation-state way, which we seem to be some way all right. But on the other hand, we have people struggling in this country, people struggling to get an education, and all the benefits too of how higher education benefits society in so many ways in general. And that all seems to be being lost in the shuffle, in this bottom line, hard-nosed economic dictatorship, which really is a form, of my view, a form of fascism, really. Because when you rely so heavily on economics, and as we know, they're manipulated so heavily, we give up a lot of our control in our society.
Certainly, right? And I think you make an important point there. I mean, if we really claim to be a democracy and people are going to participate in the selection of our political leadership, then I think one of the most basic requirements is that they should have a good education, right? I mean, I don't want people voting for the next leader of the country who, have been educated in this corporate system with these corporate biases and miss facts and.
Well, often you'll see too, and I think we can end on this note, is that the Young Communist League, you're spelling it out there. You're communist, you have very certain, very definitive views on social structure and fairness and issues around democracy, and all the good things that could happen in our society are based around these concepts. So I hope our viewers will know not to be shy and not to look at the issues that the Communist Party is bringing forward, because I think you'll see sometimes some very stark contrast between you and other parties that are calling themselves socialist or democratic socialists or whatever, and you can really see stark contrasts there.
Certainly. I believe by far that our party has the most progressive platform, and I recommend everybody take a look at it.
Well, it's going to be interesting. We're coming up into this election cycle, and we hope to have you back during that time and to fill us in on what's been happening.
I'd love to. Thank you.
My pleasure. So there you go. That wraps up our show for this week.